we are going to have a keynote speech from Graciela Sbertoli, who is one of the founders, the founder and current secretary of the European Basic Skills Network. She's going to talk about cohesive frames for quality ensured basic skills provision. So please welcome Graciela.
Very happy to be here with all of you. It was very good to have the time to go through the names, and I recognize many friends, which is very nice because it's a sort of a strange experience to be lecturing to my kitchen, which is where I'm sitting. Me too, Marian. But I'm very happy that we can go through some elements of basic skills which I consider important. I have called the presentation Cohesive Frames for Quality Ensured Basic Skills Provision, and that sounds incredibly solemn, but let's see what we can do with the theme. Let's see, there. First, let me tell you very quickly what and who is the EBSN. Many of you know us already, so I'm not going to use a lot of time with this, but it is a policy level network, and what we consider unique with the network is that it both involves policymakers, like the Finnish Ministry of Education, and what we call the policy providers, research institutions, associations of non-formal learning, associations of providers of both formal and private, so that it is about policy, but we have a foot in the policymakers and a foot where the people know what the issues are about. And our aim is to promote excellence in policy design. That means both at national and at regional level for the basic skills. And we are a bit restrict in our view of what the basic skills are, a bit restricted, but let's talk about this. I will try to say a bit about the basic skills, although I realize that I'm preaching to the converted for many of you. But then I will focus on national frameworks, which I think we should talk more about than what we do in our field, and what are the elements and how frameworks should be used to ensure quality. And then if there is time, if not, you will have it in the PowerPoint, I will talk a bit about what the EBSN is doing actually in cooperation with the PALE to promote better national policies. So first, which basic skills and why? I am aware of the enormous work that is being done by many, especially non-formal institutions, but also even the OECD and CEDEFOP, about describing what the skills are that we need now, and what is basic has been expanded. I like to think of skills as concentric centers. Circles, sorry. We put literacy, numeracy, and digital competence in the center. And because of practical reasons, also second language for immigrants, because for immigrants to Europe without the language, they don't go anywhere. So it needs to be at the center. But that doesn't mean that we don't recognize the importance of entrepreneurship, learning to learn, active citizenship, health, literacy. There are lots of themes that can be placed outside this, and the key skills needed for employment and so on. They are very important, but it's a question of first things first. You cannot really work well with all these other concentric circles unless you have a functional level of literacy, numeracy, and digital skills, and the language if you are an immigrant. So what the reason why we need to do this, of course, you saw it in the previous, I forgot to comment it, is that still 1 in 5 Europeans have difficulties. They don't have a functional level of literacy and numeracy. And when it comes to digital competence, it's much worse. It's actually 1 in 4 lack the digital competence they need. And I have a feeling sometimes that since the demands of digital skills are advancing, it's more than 1 in 4. We have noticed this in the COVID time. But let's go to the definitions. The definitions I'm using here are the Commission's definitions. Some definitions vary a bit what UNESCO considers literacy and what the Commission, they're quite similar, but there may be differences in the way they are expressed. I think you know what literacy is. Some countries put into literacy also numeracy and digital competence. I like to differentiate them because it's good to identify the different issues. And regarding this, one of the problems I can see in Europe many times is precisely regarding immigrants, that the notions of the second language and literacy are not well identified and isolated. I have heard people say this person is illiterate in German or illiterate in French. Well, then I'm illiterate in Chinese. It's not, they are two different issues and they are two different cognitive processes you need to go through to reach a functional level in literacy or in language. So even though sometimes they work together or they are going to be taught together, we need to identify the different issues. And personally, I think that having to develop literacy from scratch, becoming alphabetized in a language that is not your own, is wrong. We should try to address the question of how to teach initial literacy to immigrants from third countries in a language they are familiar with. It cannot always be their mother tongue, but the language that they really know. But that is an aside. Let's go on. When it comes to numeracy, there is an enormous discussion going on among experts in the field who don't like the term mathematical competence, because mathematical competence is considered to be too wide. In the Scandinavian countries, we have lost the problem. We don't have the word numeracy, but we call it understanding numbers. And it is because this is the core skill that will allow you to develop mathematical skills. Mathematics is about formula. Numeracy is about understanding sizes and understanding the most elementary percentages. It's an understanding of numbers, but it is what we call the forgotten basic skill. Very often when we talk about basic skills, we talk about literacy. We talk nowadays a lot about digital competence, and we forget numeracy. PIAC didn't forget it. And the other OECD surveys that came before it didn't forget it. But in policy, we tend to forget it. And it is extremely important nowadays. And it should also include a small branch that comes a little bit outside that inner concentric circle, which is financial literacy. And when we see now the new situation that the COVID has brought, it's going to be extremely important that we also include financial literacy in numeracy. Digital competence, what is important to say about this is that it doesn't really involve only the mechanics of being able to use the computers, but the attitudes, the knowledge about dangers, the knowledge about how to protect your identity and how to protect yourself, and intellectual property, everything. And the special challenge of digital competence is that it keeps developing. For most of us, if we have reached a very good level of literacy, we are not going to have to work more with the literacy. But believe me, I am finding it challenging to keep up with all the digital developments, and we will need to continue putting in more skills in the digital realm as the situation develops. So those are the basic skills we want to treat. I didn't put any definition of the second language because you know what it is in second language acquisition. And there is a very good framework at European level for second language acquisition. But what I think is extremely encouraging for us who work with basic skills is the enormous focus that the Commission's current policy for adult learning places on basic skills. Upskilling pathways deals with all the skills that a person with low levels of qualification needs to advance. But it also recognizes, see the red in the slide, that boosting basic skills is absolutely necessary to be able to reach higher levels of qualifications. Notice that I don't talk about low-skilled adults. I talk about adults with low levels of qualification. That is something that we consider important in the EBSM because many adults don't lack skills. They have some type of skills, but they lack qualifications, and very often they lack the qualifications precisely because they lack literacy, numeracy, and digital competence, so that they have holes in their skills and cannot access qualifications. Now, my main point today is about national frameworks, because I can see that a lot of countries in Europe are working with upskilling pathways, are realizing there is a mounting awareness of the importance of basic skills, but they are addressing the whole field as one, yeah, okay, this person needs more literacy. Let's send them to courses of literacy. But at what level are they? What do they need to learn? There are indicators in PIAC, but they are not arranged in a way that makes them easy to operationalize for learning. But if you do have a framework, matters are much easier. And that is what the CEDEFOP has seen when they created this analytical framework for the implementation of upskilling pathways in Europe, that it was essential to have an integrated approach from the whole country, because we know it, adult learning is a very fragmented field. And you can address adult learning processes through education, through employment, through inclusion, through health, through social. Very often the courses are extremely different. You don't know, a person may go through a process and then they access it through another door and they have to start at the scratch. So to have this common understanding of what we mean by literacy, what we mean by different levels of literacy, how it should be addressed to really make it flexible and tailored to the individual. That common understanding can be based, should be based in a common strategy and a common framework, and with a vision of guidelines on how to address this, how to customize it to the individual, and how everybody should be, all the stakeholders should be cooperating to give good provision. Adaptable and flexible are extremely important concepts, but as in many things in life, you have to be able to think two apparently contradictory concepts at the same time. We need a vision that is the same for everyone of what the skills are, a framework with levels that are for everybody, with indicators and competence goals that are common to everybody. And then in practice, when you are going to implement the provision, the learning, you need to adapt it to the individual. But if you know what the framework is, it's much easier than if you are just accessing a cloud of literacy. So we need to define, that is what frameworks are about. And why we need the national framework for basic skills? Well, it has been discussed that I am too bombastic about this, but I think the EQF and the NQF are not enough for basic skills for adults. And there are several reasons. One is that because they address the whole field of skills and education, they are often not detailed enough when it comes to what literacy means, the indicators for literacy. They are there for children, but we are talking now about adult learning, and it is different. And also because you can place a person because of their education in a certain level of NQF. They may have qualifications at a pretty high level and then have holes in some of the basic skills. The obvious example is digital skills. You can have people with PhD and extremely low levels of digital skills, but that also happens actually with literacy and numeracy. In numeracy, we know that even colleagues that have many years of university education can say, oh, me and numbers, you know, I'm not good at this. So many people have actually holes in their numeracy, but also in literacy. We know that people that are dyslexic and actually have low level of functional literacy have managed to compensate somehow and have gone forth and have qualifications, but there are holes. So we need a framework that defines the competence goals only for literacy, numeracy, digital skills, so that we can address them in the way that is needed. There is a need for consensus from all providers, from all policymakers, on what the levels are, what the outcomes are at different levels. And that allows us to benchmark, to monitor the quality, to develop models, and also extremely important to create provision in a modular way so that the learner can have this feeling of progressing on a path towards functional literacy and numeracy or digital skills, and also be involved in the creation of his or her own learning path. So the fact of having a framework adds to develop tailored courses and provision organized in modules. Now, there are more things than indicators in the national framework. To be able to use it so that it ensures quality of provision, you need to have these competence goals indicators that are very detailed, but general in the sense that how you exemplify this will depend on the individual. So you don't say reading a book of this type, you say the indicator will be being able to understand a short sentence of a field you're familiar with. And then what you're familiar with will depend on the individual. That is how good frameworks need to be. But a framework needs also to involve a lot of guidance, handbooks for the providers, handbooks for the people that do professional guidance of the target group, diagnose systems, because some of the learners who have low levels of qualification of literacy or numeracy or digital skills will have specific difficulties. We talk about diagnose when it deals with realizing whether there is dyslexia or some connected specific difficulty. To create individual paths, you need to have learned how to guide the learners. So there is a whole frame outside the framework of competence goals that needs to be in place to be able to ensure quality. And in some areas, we need also to change attitudes, especially in some countries. There are countries in Europe still very focused on what is the accreditation of the final level so that you can have a qualification. But the framework should help you with the initial assessment, which is part of upskilling pathways, and with the formative assessment, which the learner should be involved in, on knowing how far have you come, what have you now mastered. You weren't able to do this, now you can do this, and you're advancing towards a level, okay, so far you have arrived. Now this is the end of this module. Now you can start a new module and we will take you to the level of functional literacy, numeracy, digital skills. And very, very important, because this is forgotten in many countries, the fact that a teacher is a teacher, knows adult learning principles and can read doesn't make you a literacy trainer. There is more knowledge that needs to be there. You need also continuous professional development. There needs to be a provision for initial teacher training on basic skills, for continuous professional development, for the time needed to adapt your courses to the learner's individual needs. There is a whole framework. And as was said once in a workshop from the European Commission that I attended, this is like a table with 4 legs. Granted, there are tables that manage well with 3 legs, but not with 2. If you don't have all the elements in a policy, one of the elements may be very good, but the table doesn't hold. So we need to really look at all the elements of a framework. For some of the basic skills, there are already European frameworks. I mentioned before the Common European Framework of Reference for Languages, which is very good and which actually addresses a little bit questions of literacy in the first level. But as I said, I think it should be identified as a different issue. This framework works excellently well, and it's probably the one that doesn't necessarily need to be adapted to the needs of a particular country. But for some of the others, even if it's only to make it be consequent with the NQF and with how the rest of the education sector deals with basic skills, the European frameworks are very useful, but they do need to be somewhat adapted. For digital competence, there is an excellent framework developed by the European Union, which is the COMP, and which goes much further than what you would call functional digital skills, but it is enough with the 3 or 4 first levels. And there is an important work in progress to create a common European numeracy framework. It was going to be presented in the annual conference of the EBSN that now has had to be postponed. We will see what happens. But we are following this work for the common European numeracy framework. But strangely enough, we still don't have a common European literacy framework. There's been a lot of work being done in literacy, but in most countries, we have developed different ways of addressing literacy. I live in Norway. I have worked at Skills Norway until I sort of retired to work only with the EBSN. But I know well the Norwegian system, and I really recommend that you look at the kompetansemålene, that's in Norwegian, it's the competence goals that Skills Norway has developed. One of the things that I like specifically about this system is that the indicators are expressed very clearly and divided also for how it can work for education, for employment, or for individual social life. But also we have created something we call the professional profiles for basic skills, so that you can see how that framework, which is common for everybody, can be expressed for different professions. So you have what literacy, numeracy, and digital skills mean for an electrician, a plumber, a bus driver, a person working in retail. So it is expressed, and that makes it much easier for the provider, for the teacher, to create contextualized materials for the provision. In France, they have an agency that deals specifically with the literacy of native individuals, and actually they don't define it like that. They define it as people who have gone through all their primary compulsory education in France, so that it's not the problem of literacy of coming to a new country, it's a literacy problem. And they have a good framework, which the PPT gives you a link to. I realize you were looking for concrete examples, but if we were going to go through all these in 20 minutes, it's impossible. I would like also to go outside Europe and have you look at the Australian core skills framework, which is extremely interesting. And I don't want to end without noticing two specific examples from the UK, which I consider very interesting. The second one has to do with the financial literacy that I talked about when I talked about numeracy. But the citizens curriculum that has been developed by Learning and Work is extremely interesting. It goes actually much wider than for the basic skills, but it's a way of showing how all the stakeholders should get together to create an adaptation of a national framework. So the citizens curriculum shows what the framework should be, but it also shows you how to adapt it to the specific needs of a community. And one thing that for policymakers is very interesting about the citizens curriculum is that they have actually been able to prove return of investment. They have, as they say, done the sums and have found out that all the money that has been invested by local authorities in developing provision according to the citizens curriculum has actually earned the money in terms of saving money for social expenses, health expenses, etc. So it is very interesting. Now, because we work for development of policy for basic skills, and we have realized in the EBSN that one of the main problems for the development of policy in Europe nowadays is that the provision is fragmented. Even the awareness is fragmented about the problem of the issue of basic skills. So we realize that we need to create tools to enhance the awareness and the knowledge about basic skills in stakeholders at policy level who are not necessarily in education. So if you want to talk to a colleague who you realize doesn't understand the difference between initial literacy and functional literacy, believe me, there are many of those. So what do you do? How do you explain it? Is there a place that you can send them to? Because there is good information. So in cooperation with EPALE, EBSN has been creating open education resources units addressing particular themes and has started to create some MOOC courses. Now, you know, there's been this change in Nepal, and there has been a hiatus in a break in the involvement of EBSN in Nepal, but we are right now in the process of a new contract with Nepal to continue doing this. So I just want to tell you to look at the EBSN capacity building series, because it shows you how basic skills relate to all these different sectors, and it gives you a lot of information that can be useful both for colleagues and for junior colleagues and so on. So this shows you the ones that are already in existence, and they are on Nepal, and you can get in touch with us with ideas for further tools that we could include in the series, or questions or comments or whatever. And I think that we are on time for just a couple of questions, so I will stop sharing my screen now. Yeah, there.
Thank you, Graciela. We have a couple. There's one comment first from Nina Hjelt that afternoon at 2 p.m. Central European Time. In this webinar, there's an introduction to work on Finland that's based on the Citizens curriculum at the Life Skills Workshop. So it's also a model that has spread very well across Europe. We have one question so far from Martina Kjellf, asking about the term life skills and where you would situate it in the circle of skills. Is it a useful term to describe the health, emotional, environmental, etc., all these skills which have come into particular spotlight now in times of lockdown and COVID-19? What do you think?
I realize I should have had a slide with those circles, but I was a bit wary of it because the definitions vary so much that it's you get into long discussions with definitions. But in my head, this is my individual attitude to this, I think basic skills are the core. And then you have a circle that involves basic skills, but goes much wider, which is life skills, which has the focus on the individual, what you need for active citizenship, welfare, and functioning. And there is another circle that also involves basic skills, but let's write it in another direction, which is what they call key skills, which I interpret more as moving towards employability. But yes, as I said, we recognize the enormous importance of all these additional skills, but first things first.
Okay, then there's a comment from Sonja Haga Eriksson, that it's important to address the difference between native language and second language skills, and difference between language and literacy skills. Spoken language is innate, written is invented, and also dyslexia, which is present in approximately 10% of the population. Teaching literacy to these groups is very different from teaching literacy to others. So,
yeah, I agree. I'm only a bit surprised that you say 10% of the population has dyslexia. That is a bit surprising to me. I think that percentage is a bit too high, because we consider dyslexia a very specific learning difficulty. You may have very low levels of literacy for other reasons, for emotional hindrances when you learn or whatever, and that is not dyslexia. But yes, it is very important to distinguish all these different issues.
Then there's a question from Ivana Studena. How would you suggest that the relationship between skills and competencies is usefully applied in policy frameworks?
Difference between skills and competencies. I always find these definitions so difficult. What I think is useful for policy is to make a difference between the outcomes and the general operational skill. The outcome of learning needs to be expressed, as I said, in indicators. But very often, what is the difference between skills and competencies? If anybody in the room wants to answer that, I'm very pleased, because I don't know how to define it.
I could. We at one point we've been involved in validation projects for volunteering. So we've been talking about this and talked about the skill of the ability to do, and also the confidence that comes with doing it.
People understanding and skills doesn't necessarily. So, but these are complicated definitions, and I'm not sure. The question was how they can be used for better policy. I'm not sure that this sort of splitting of hairs contributes to better policy.
That's an interesting point of view, and Ivana goes on to say that the difference is that causes much confusion among stakeholders, and I yes, have noticed that.
Yeah.
And a lot of people have commented and thanked you. It's been a very inspiring presentation. We have space for one more question, and then we're going to go into the breakout rooms. If anyone wants to ask something or comment on something, there would be a very interesting policy related discussion that we could move to.